All right, my people, let's do a little philosophy. Today we'll be doing a little bit of philosophy of religion. It's going to include some conceptual analysis, argument analysis, and hopefully boatloads of critical thinking. We're going to do all that stuff as we examine an argument that comes from this video that's posted to the Reasonable Faith YouTube channel, which I believe is the channel and organization of one Dr. William Lane Craig. I chose this video for a couple of reasons. One, the problem of evil is just interesting and cool to think about. Secondly, I love that Craig's organization and the YouTube channel associated with it are called Reasonable Faith because I am a huge fan of reason. So in order to examine the argument that Craig gives in this video, we are going to define some terms, watch the video and identify the premises and conclusion to the argument that he gives, flesh out those premises, flesh out the argument, make sure we have a complete understanding of it, then we'll evaluate the argument to see if it works. We'll come to a determination as to whether or not this specific argument serves to defend against the problem of evil and hopefully get a little closer to answering the question, is it possible for an all-good, all-powerful God to exist in a world that seems to have buckets full of evil in it? A few things before we get started. There are lots and lots and lots of other arguments that attempt to defend against the problem of evil. For this video, we're specifically talking about the argument that Craig gives here. Second, my goal is to challenge people to think better. If you are unwilling or incapable of trying to examine the arguments as objectively as you can with the goal of getting closer to the truth, do not watch this video and do not comment on it. You will just be wasting your time and mine. If you don't want to engage with the ideas and you don't want to engage with the other people in this badass YouTube community of awesomeness, go watch funny cat videos. I'm pretty hilarious when I'm discussing the horrible evil and suffering in the world, but I'm not that funny. Lastly, because we are going to be talking about evil and suffering, if you aren't in a spot where you can consider all sorts of horrible suffering that's part of the human experience, don't watch this video today. It's not worth it. I am not that good. All right, all that said, let's jump in. So the first thing we need to do is define our terms so we make sure that we're not going to equivocate. The concepts and the definitions and words I'm going to use to relay those concepts, I'm borrowing largely from a paper by J.L. Mackie called Evil and Omnipotence. I'm doing that for two reasons. One, it gives me a reason to bring up the paper, and if you want to have a well-rounded, complete view of the philosophical approach to the problem of evil, you have to read the paper. It's amazing. Read it. Even if you disagree with it, the act of struggling with his argument will make your ideas better. If it interests you, check out this video. It's a little longer, more thorough examination of Mackie's argument, and it's more or less what I presented in a philosophy of religion class. The second reason I used Mackie's definitions, they've been around for a really long time, and they're relatively conventional. First, we got to nail down our concept of God. And the concept of God we're going to be talking about is the one Craig's talking about. It's his argument, so I can't make up some other God to argue against. And that God's going to be an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful, creator of the universe, personifiable God. We're not going to talk explicitly about his being all-knowing, because it's not going to be super relevant to this argument. He is going to be the creator of the universe, which means he created the universe and everything in it. The stars, the sun, the moon, the monkeys, the trees, the dogs, the cats, the human beings. He not only created the world and the laws of physics that govern that world, he created us as well. That God is all good and or all loving. If God's all good, he'll get rid of all of the evil he's capable of getting rid of. If he's all loving, he'd get rid of all of the evil that the beings he loves experience. Now, I see some light bulbs going off. I know that some people are already objecting, and I love it. You're thinking, but he's only going to get rid of the evil he can get rid of without making the world worse. He's only going to get rid of the evil he can get rid of while maintaining the quality of the world as it is or make the world better. Whether or not he's capable of doing that is entirely what Craig's argument's going to be about. So hold on to it. God is all-powerful, meaning he can do anything. We'll add a minor restriction to his power, which is he can't violate the laws of logic. He can't make true contradictions or round squares or married bachelors. That's a totally acceptable concession to make because if we said that God was totally irrational and could do anything, then we wouldn't have any means of understanding any of it, because it seems like kind of those truths of reason are sort of foundational for us to understand anything at all. So God can do anything. He can violate laws of physics, he can make pigs fly, he can bring frogs from the sky, he can resurrect people, but he cannot violate the laws of logic. He can't make 2 + 2 = 17. He can't make a round square. Evil, at the very least, we're going to say evil is unnecessary suffering. It's suffering that we could do without. It's suffering that without it, the world doesn't get any worse. The child with epidermolysis bullosa, whose skin basically doesn't adhere to itself, so their life is full of painful blisters and sores, and oftentimes to fight infection, they need to have their bandages changed daily, and since their skin doesn't adhere to itself, they are basically being skinned alive, all of which is due to no fault of their own. That's evil. That's suffering. Lastly, we want to make sure that we recognize that evil is opposed to good and good is opposed to evil. The Christian tradition depends on good and evil being opposed to one another. So we can be sure that Craig believes this. Whether we're talking about sin, whether you believe anything about the fall from grace, whether or not you believe in Satan's or demons or anything else, none of that will make a lick of sense if good and evil aren't opposed to one another. So if you don't agree with any of these definitions, you already have decided the problem of evil isn't a problem for you, but you also don't agree with Dr. William Lane Craig about his faith or Christianity. Definitions definitioned, concepts analyzed. Let's get to the argument.
You see, what the atheist has to say, he's got to be able to prove that it is impossible or improbable for God to have a morally sufficient reason for permitting these facts of suffering. And that's a burden of proof, which is so heavy that no atheist has ever been able to sustain it.
So at the beginning of this video, Craig just gives an overview of what the argument is. In order to show that an all-good, all-powerful God could not exist in a world with so much evil in it, the atheist would have to show it impossible or improbable for God to have adequate moral justification for allowing the evil and suffering in the world. He believes that no atheist has ever been able to sustain that argument. Challenge accepted, Dr. William Lane Craig. And since I haven't finished this video, and he certainly hasn't seen it, he holds that it is absolutely not improbable that an all-good, all-powerful God exists in a world with evil in it. But this is just a sketch of the argument. We need an explanation as to how and why he believes the atheist is incapable of sustaining this argument and the argument is incapable of being made.
Take someone's little daughter dying of leukemia or getting run over by an automobile. We don't see why that happened, and we wondered why wouldn't a sovereign God intervene to stop it? And what the atheist has to say is that it's either impossible or it's highly improbable that God could have a morally justifying reason for allowing that to occur. But there's no way, given our finitude, our limits in space and time, for being able to make that kind of a claim with any justification. God's morally sufficient reason for allowing your daughter's death might not emerge until 300 years from now, maybe in another country. Every event that occurs sends a ripple effect through history, so that the consequences of any event are simply incalculable and incomprehensible for finite local persons. So the atheist is making a claim here which is just completely unsustainable. There's no way for him to show that it's improbable or impossible that God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing this evil to occur, and therefore his argument really has no intellectual credibility.
So let's go through this argument premise by premise. First, the characterization of the innocent girl getting leukemia and or getting hit by a car, totally legitimate example of what we would talk about as the sort of suffering we would think God could prevent. Really horrible things happen to innocent people, so we might as well make it that she both has leukemia and then gets hit by a car in a horribly painful, terrible car wreck. And the challenge, Craig says, is the atheist must show how and why the leukemia and the car wreck aren't justified in God's eyes or aren't justified, period. And this is a really important premise. He says there is no way that the atheist can show that God's reason is unjustified because we don't have that reason. This is where he's oversimplifying the argument. We may not need to know the specific reason to know that it's unjustified because we might know what an all-good, all-powerful God could do. So rather than trying to identify that reason and then adjudicate whether that reason's a good one or a bad one, we know that an all-good, all-powerful God doesn't exist because whatever reasons are given would be those reasons of a not all-good, not all-powerful God. Why? because it seems like God could do otherwise. Whatever his reasons are, he could have done it without causing the suffering. Craig explains further as to how and why we would be incapable of understanding God's reasoning. By relying on this sort of butterfly effect, the consequences of the leukemia and the car wreck might be hundreds of years down the line in another country. Let's just say they stop in World War V, which would destroy all of humanity. There are a couple of problems with this explanation. One, he's relying on this notion of a butterfly effect that comes from sort of quantum theory in a deterministic, mechanistic, materialist system. A butterfly flapping its wings might cause a hurricane or tsunami or something halfway around the globe. The problem with Craig's analysis is sometimes a butterfly just flaps its wings. There's been all sorts of modeling of how this works, and the theory is that sometimes really little, apparently insignificant events can cause huge things to happen all the way around the globe hundreds of years later. So his claim that every event has some sort of significant ripple effect through history is just completely unjustified. He has no reasons or evidence to support that claim. Furthermore, and more importantly, those are laws of physics. God can break those laws all he wants. He created those laws. He could have made the laws different from the beginning. This is a dude who can bring people back from the dead, water to wine, boatloads of fish coming out of people's ears. He can do anything he wants as long as it doesn't violate the laws of logic. And laws of physics are not laws of logic. He can make pigs fly. He can make it so that World War V doesn't start regardless of whether or not this poor girl gets leukemia and gets hit by a car. If you say he can't do that, you're saying there is something he cannot do, which means he's no longer all-powerful. If you're saying he won't do that, he's violating the all-goodness because he's allowing for suffering that is unnecessary in the world. So when Craig gets to this final claim that there is no way to show that God doesn't have good reason for allowing evil, the person taking the atheist position in this circumstance can say, hell yeah, I do. He could have done otherwise. And we know for a fact that there are better ways to have gotten it done. God could have done something much better, something much more loving, something much more caring, something much more gooder. And since God didn't, he's either kind of a jerk or he's not as powerful as you think he is. He ends by saying, therefore, those taking the atheist position and presenting the problem of evil have no intellectual credibility. People don't believe the problem of evil dismisses the idea of an all-good, all-powerful God because they know God's reasons or know God's characteristics. They just know the characteristics and reasons of a God who would have created this world with this much suffering isn't all good and isn't all powerful. And I know that I've heard an argument similar to this from Dr. William Lane Craig. The following comes from a clip in a debate where he's talking about Russell's teapot. The dude debating Craig made an argument wherein he was saying, if we follow the theist line of thinking, we can't prove that Dr. William Lane Craig is not a kangaroo. And Craig responded this way.
You see, the failure of those illustrations is that the reason we don't believe that I'm a kangaroo is not because of the absence of evidence that I am a kangaroo. Rather, it is the presence of evidence that I am not a kangaroo. Like, we have good evidence that I'm Homo sapiens.
So the reason we don't believe Craig is a kangaroo isn't because of a lack of understanding or evidence for Craig's being a kangaroo. It's because of all the evidence we have that Craig is not a kangaroo. What the hell does this have to do with our problem of evil? Well, if Craig's right about his not being a kangaroo, then he also has to be right about this. The reason people don't believe that God is all good and all powerful isn't because of a lack of evidence for God's good reasons or morally justifiable reasons for why he allows suffering in the world. It's the presence of all the evidence that God is not all good and all powerful. And that evidence is the suffering in the world. If Craig's logic is sustainable and credible when arguing for the existence of God, then it's also sustainable and credible when arguing against the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God. Does Craig's argument work? Absolutely not, because we don't need to know God's specific reason in order to show that an all-good, all-powerful God wouldn't give it. And the evidence we have that God is not all-good and all-powerful is the suffering in the world, because the suffering in the world would be reflective of a relatively cruel, impotent creator of the universe. Refuting this argument only opens the door to a whole bunch of other arguments, which I'm going to cover in future videos. If you have a specific objection to the specific argument here, I would love to hear about it in the comments. And if there's other problem of evil defenses or theodicies you really want to hear about it, let me know. As always, thank you so much for the time. Bye.